Okay, welcome back everyone. I know that a few people will still be filtering in, but in the essence of time, we'd like to go ahead and get started. So first, we have George Dailey, who has been with Esri for many years. He is a demographer and rural sociologist by trade, and also a geospatial cheerleader. He didn't bring his pom-poms, so don't worry, we're good on that front. Okay, well that's the after show. He's been with Esri since 1993 and is a member of the education program. He wants to emphasize Esri's commitment to the use of GIS in education and his longstanding work with the education team. Will be talked about some here in a little bit. After George, we have Dr. Tiwari of UNT. He is a medical geographer by trade who specializes in the application of spatial analysis methods and geospatial technologies, particularly open source, for understanding spatiotemporal dynamics and disease outcomes. His specific research interests include disease mapping, cluster analysis, environmental health, and computational geography. And lastly, while it's on the program, Ben McGill had to step out at the last minute. So also from DCCCD, we have Daniella Ramirez, who will be giving a short presentation. She's from the same department, so she'll just be filling in for him. So with that, I turn it over to George.
So that was a brilliant presentation that you just gave, and it's really hard to kind of come after that. So I just want you to know this is not water in this bottle. I did a quick change of that. The thing that I want to spend some time talking about as folks were saying earlier this morning, talking about BLS, the Census Bureau, to try and talk about what those holdings are in 10 minutes, that's like pretty phenomenal work. So I've decided to kind of go off on a little different tangent. I'm going to basically focus on 4 ideas. But before we go there, I also want to kind of talk about the comments that Bernie was making this morning. So he had mentioned that in federal agencies, Esri technology is pretty ubiquitous, and that's a fact. And so yes, it's proprietary software, much like Microsoft Access, and we can go down the list. The thing that is so, I think, important about that is that ubiquitous nature is providing a geographic foundation across all of those agencies and ultimately providing data to countless users, researchers, et cetera. The other thing that's, I think, important is the number of state and local governments. So as we think about regional and local data, those entities are also utilizing ArcGIS. And so the notion of collaboration, sharing, federated data systems, and that's one of those pieces that I think becomes really important is we as an entity, a company, we're not in charge of what BLS puts together. They're the authoritative source. They're curating. Same thing with the Census Bureau. And so as we think about being able to have access to data, I think it becomes important to look at what those foundations are. Other thing that Bernie had brought up was talking about libraries and both academic libraries and research libraries. For about 25 years, we have had a program aimed at providing software to universities and research libraries. So if you have questions about that, we don't need to wander into those waters right now, but please come talk to me afterwards and we can kind of sort that out. As I say, what I want to focus on is basically 4 ideas. And this is the first one, and it's come up several times today. The idea that we have a cornerstone in American society that is authoritative, curated, and open data. I have, I feel like I should stand up here and say, hi, I'm George. I'm a data addict. So for over 40 years, this is what I've been doing, is working with census data, socioeconomic data, Before coming to Esri, I worked for the Census Bureau for about 9 years in DC, and before that I was a city demographer in Oklahoma City. And what I saw across, or have seen across those 40 plus years, is genuine use of data, creation of really essential information, and in the last year, the notion that authoritative, curated, what is data in an era of fake news, alternative facts, direct attacks against science institutions, that just shakes me up. And so this is my first tenet for us today. And if I think about what might be a quintessential piece of that data trail, it actually comes down to this volume. Any guesses? Old? Well, it's not that old. This is a reprint. What's in the Constitution? A census. So this is the 1790 census. 52 pages, a full deck. I'm impressed. But, this is our national, state, and local database for 1790, the whole thing. And a pattern was put in place at that time that this is going to be repeated. Other thing that's pretty interesting is when you read Article 1, Section 2, there's a clause that says, in such manner as they shall by law direct, meaning Congress will decide. As Susanna was talking about, we as a legislative body, we will decide that we need some BLS data. We need to know about income, poverty, employment, et cetera. And so obviously this has changed over time. And here's a little section from Vermont. And one of the other pieces in here is a breakout on males above and below age 16. Any ideas why? Right. I mean, basically, let's make sure. We just kind of broke away from Great Britain. Wouldn't it be nice if we knew where we might be able to put together a military force? Well, here's an unintended result of the 1790 census. This, I think, and I'm sorry it's so faint to try and read, I think this is the first written census data request, believe it or not. And so basically, in a nutshell, it is the Postmaster General asking Thomas Jefferson for a spare copy of that document to be able to assess population around new post roads. Pretty sensible, pretty sensible. And what you saw in that book, it's also about geography. And okay, I work for a geography company. And I also learned early on in life that the abbreviation for my name is Geo. Now, so I could have gone into a geography place, or I could have gone maybe geology, and maybe that's why my Twitter handle is Maps and Rocks. But geography is essential in all of these, whether we're talking about states, counties, census tracts, on down the line. And so, spinning forward to the 21st century, we have put in place something called the Living Atlas of the World. Anybody know of it? Okay, we got two hands. Take some time to go off and explore. And so people who know us as a GIS company think of us as software. In the last 10 plus years, we've really also become a geographic content company. And so all of those people that are users, those federal agencies, those state and local entities, people are able to contribute. And so you'll see a button that says contribute and a button that says browse. And so when I get into the Living Atlas of the World, what I begin to find are base maps, demographics, landscapes, imagery, on down the line. And so the idea of this being a place that holds curated, authoritative data that is much of it coming from a federal agency, from USGS, from the Forest Service, et cetera. And another activity that we've got going on is what we call open access. So this leads to local open data hubs. Okay, so one, this place, and I sort of should have moved that over, but there are currently about 4,000-ish entities that are providing access to their geographic data inside this hub. And then what folks are also doing with our APIs, they're beginning to build their own websites. So here is the city of Arlington, Texas. And so from a citizen standpoint, a business standpoint, on down the line, people who want to be able to know more about their community, putting together a one-stop shop. And the idea that these can be federated, where I begin to pull data from multiple locations. So for instance, in Los Angeles, the mayor of Los Angeles has decided to create what's called a GeoHub. So pulling together data from academia, from school districts, from, pick an agency, and it becomes one place that people can go to. And we're just watching this take off. Another concept is expectation. So, what do I mean by expectation? I expect that I can go off and find data, interact with data on any device, at any time, anywhere. How many devices does anybody have with them right now? Just one, two? Whoa, dude. You're sitting with three? Okay. And, we all have these tools now. And, it fits, right in with the presentation we just heard. It's about, I want to be able to access information at the drop of a hat. And so, some of that might turn into an application like this iPad app called QuakeFeed. So this is a couple out in LA, business partners with us. Think they would like to, map out earthquakes in Los Angeles? Yeah. So free app, and oh, by the way, for 99 cents, you get rid of the ads. But what they're doing is mining the USGS 7-day feed. And so, we're seeing these take off. It's like one a day. I took this screenshot yesterday. Here's us. No earthquakes around us, but in Oklahoma, things are still shaking with, various, well, we won't go into fracking. That's a different story. And taking that app down to the level of, I want to put something on my phone that helps me find my way around a campus. So this is the University of Oregon, and they have created a very wonderful application. What this brings together is things like, hey, I'm cruising across campus at night. Where is it safe? Where is it lit? Where's a call box? Or, hey, I want to take mom and dad on a tour. So let's go off and explore sustainability on the University of Oregon campus. Oh, by the way, I'm a donor. I want, that would be a good thing to do too. Or just navigate me. And they've now added the ability to go inside the building. So they've rolled this all into one application. So, the expectation is I can do this all the time. Other concept that I want to bring up is stakeholders. How many different stakeholders do any of you have at a library? Who are some of your stakeholders? Okay, you got patrons, donors.
Students, faculty, staff.
Yeah, students, faculty, staff. Is it changing? Do you see stakeholders changing in your world? So one of the things that we're observing, so I'm a geo geek. I'm a data freak. I have been, immersed in this world, and there was a time those were the only people that you were interacting with. That's not the case anymore. So stakeholders include people like senior execs. So this is Oakland Unified School District in California, and this is what's called a story map. So templates we've put together that are free for use, and they decided, the demographer, the GIS team, to be able to prepare for the superintendent and the board, we got to make this simple. So they put together a strategic plan that basically is this story map. And it goes through a number of different areas. The one section that I've highlighted here, so they're looking at school environment. And so, anybody know the Oakland area? I think you do. So Berkeley is up that way. The Bay, Bay Area is here. And I'll tell you on this, blue is good, red is not. And so this is a measure of environmental stress for each of these campuses. And so to be able to present that to a stakeholder like a superintendent and a board member around what's going on in that northeast area. So pretty powerful. And taking it from senior execs down to students. So this is Clemson University and their Center for Geographic Studies basically put together a nice story map that's about mapping Tigertown. Okay, so it's their campus, 2D, 3D. The thing that grabbed me the most was on this, and I've been including links in this, the very last tab in this story map leads to an app that I go out as a student and I'm wandering around campus and I get to a spot where I go, I don't feel safe here. Click, photo, comment. That is then going into a database, and while it's hard to see back there, what's been created is a heat map that I could then provide to public safety on campus to be able to see where things are good and not. And so those four concepts, that's all I really wanted to cover today, and then also to say, in my book, open data equals our future. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Douglas, and thank you for inviting me to this symposium. Douglas asked me to talk briefly about some of the work that we've been doing, and particularly sort of focus in on the challenges of using geospatial data and geographic data. And so there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about briefly this afternoon, and I'll try to sort of contextualize those issues through two projects that we've been involved with over the last several years, actually. And I guess I'll start with, you have a map that's up here, but I'll talk about this a little bit later in a little bit. But I'd like to talk about the first project that we've been working on since about 2008. And we've had sort of multiple rounds of funding for this, and these are projects that are funded by the National Institutes of Health. And I've been working with collaborators in computer science, as well as in geography, which is where I work. The project is essentially the development of a system for assisting public health decision makers or public health preparedness decision makers in terms of trying to help them to develop response plans for bioemergencies, right? So the idea is that, in the event of some type of a bioterrorist attack, for instance, say an anthrax attack, what should the response be in terms of trying to vaccinate the population, right? And so these are often critical response plans. These are critical plans that need to be enforced within very short time frames, and you typically would like to vaccinate the entire population, right? So there's 100% coverage that's required during a very short timeline. So the challenges for sort of implementing something like this, I think there are really two sort of key challenges that we think about. The first is in terms of trying to fit data to objectives, right? So in this first project, the objectives are typically defined by some federal entities, and these objectives tend to be a little bit vague because the implementation is typically done at sort of the state, local, and county levels. So in the case of this particular problem, the CDC sort of sets these broader objectives, and they basically come down and say, well, all states and local governments should have fully functional plans that would enable response in the event of some type of attack, right? Now, what does that mean, right? And how does that translate in terms of this actual plan that needs to be built? And so the first, I think, challenge that we have, these plans have to be data-driven to some extent, because you are, sort of talking about, fairly large populations, very complex data sets, and then again trying to develop strategies that could leverage the data that we have in terms of sort of building these plans, what we call functional plans, right? So these plans you should demonstrate that they will work. So the first challenge then becomes, how do you sort of link the existing data sets that we have with these objectives, right? What does this mean? To build a functional plan, to be able to vaccinate everybody, 100% of the population within 36 hours, how does that translate? What's the relationship between the translation of the development of the plan and the actual data that gets fed into it? And so in our case, of course, we rely on several publicly available data sets, primarily the census, in terms of looking at populations, right? So we say, well, we've got good population data, or about as good as it gets. We've got some information about where these people are located, so we could sort of leverage that information about population densities, some of the spatial context, and then essentially that becomes the starting point for the development of such plans. An associated sort of problem with this is as you start expanding this definition or this objective of functionality, of being fully functional, you start to ask deeper questions. You start to say, well, not only do I want to know where my populations are, but maybe I should also be thinking about the specific needs of those populations, right? So again, if you think about vulnerabilities in vulnerable populations, for instance, one example could be you're saying, well, maybe we need translators, for those individuals who are unable to, who do not speak English well, or do we need wheelchair access ramps and so on and so forth, right? So there's a number of these more subtle types of data needs that become evident as you start thinking about developing these plans. So I think the first challenge that we've sort of faced is in terms of trying to link these objectives to data definitions, right? What data sets are actually contributing to the development of such plans? The second problem that becomes a little bit more challenging, and it's more geographical, is that as you start to look at available data, in this case through the census or through local city governments, for instance, right? So maybe a local police department that has some specific knowledge, that is not available in the larger census. But as you start to think about these different data sets, we're sort of forced almost to choose a specific geographic context, right? So in the case of census data, for instance, we could be saying, well, a lot of this data is available to us at the block group level, for instance, right? So there's an inherent choice that's being made at that point in time that we're going to develop these functional plans, but the basis for that plan is this unit, this geographic unit, which actually has a lot of uncertainty associated with it, right? So for example, if we were to build a plan and in the event that something happens, I say, well, if you're in block group X, go to this particular facility, right? How many people actually can relate to that? I mean, does anybody know what block group you live in, right? And that's very unlikely, right? So we start to say, okay, well, block groups are a good data measure as far as the census is concerned, but it's not necessarily a great data measure in terms of trying to, tell people where to go. And so, well, we start to think about units that people are more familiar with, for example, a zip code, right? So zip codes are great because almost everybody knows which zip code they're in. The problem with zip codes, as you start to see where I'm going with this, hopefully, is that zip codes are not really a census entity, right? I mean, they're a postal entity, and they're constantly changing. The geographic boundaries of zip codes are actually fairly dynamic and, in fact, fairly uncertain. Now, there are census equivalent products like ZICTAs, which try to approximate these boundaries, but they're not, there's actually a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of geographic uncertainty between these definitions. So, the first challenge, right, is this notion of defining objectives to data, and then the second challenge then becomes this idea of saying, well, now, if you're able to successfully map objectives to data, we're inherently having to make some decisions about these spatial units, and there's tremendous amounts of uncertainty in those geographic boundaries, right? So zip code boundaries, for instance, do not necessarily align with block group boundaries, right? So if you've got data set A that's available at a zip code level and data set B that's available, say, at the block group level, trying to reconcile these different data sets at different resolutions is highly problematic, right? So those are the two issues, right? With data becoming easily available, right? There's a lot of information that could be downloaded. I think the problem that we see as sort of geographers is that the degrees of resolution, the spatial boundaries that these data sets are available in are not generally aligned, right? In fact, you could sort of, as you start looking at this problem, there are other issues that come into play, looking at things like the degree of reliability, for instance, across these different data sets, right? The spatial reliability also is fairly inconsistent. Again, if you're looking at data that are coming from different sources, right? So if you've got a census data set versus looking at, let's say, a city data set, for instance, the amount of the reliability of those data sets across space can be drastically different. In fact, I think the census does, produce measures of error. There's margins of errors that are associated with a lot of census data. And if you were to make a map of those, the patterns are really interesting. I would imagine that, urban areas tend to have lower margins of error just because you have larger, populations and sample sizes available. And as you start looking at rural areas, for instance, again, the level of uncertainty or the degree of error, if you will, on the data set varies as well. So you could produce a single map where the problem with this, if we're saying we want to develop a fully functional plan, the problem is as we look at a map of our fully functional plan, that the level of reliability is inconsistent across the map, right? And generally, it turns out that urban areas are, more likely to have more reliable data than rural areas. So the map that you see over here is another example of this idea of uncertainty and biases in uncertainty. And this is actually work that we did a couple of years ago. And we were looking at data from CDC. This is mortality data that's available through the CDC portal. It's called Wonder. And Wonder is a data set or a portal that a lot of people use to look at health-related outcomes. And these are maps that we're producing of heart disease mortality in the US. What we tried to do over here essentially was try to reproduce a map of heart disease mortality among populations over the age of 35 using this publicly available data set, right? So we use the same algorithms, we use the same cut points, and so on and so forth. And we basically did exactly what the CDC would have done in terms of looking at measures of mortality. And what we end up getting is this map on top, right? This figure A. We compared this map to a gold standard map that we had access to. And again, this is a map where the data set was complete, and we had more information to produce that map. And when we sort of created a difference map between what we were able to reproduce from publicly available data, which is map A, and sort of this gold standard map, which I don't have over here, what we ended up getting is map B, and that's the difference map, right? So the shades of red there are indicating underestimation of mortality rates. And so what's happening over here is pretty interesting. As the CDC releases some of this data, some of it gets suppressed for reasons of privacy and confidentiality, right? So if there are observations that have less than 10 counts, right, and that's sort of a definition that's used by many agencies, that data is not released, right? So for somebody who's not careful or is not thinking about the sort of underlying processes and how data is being released, what you would end up making is a map that includes data that is suppressed, potentially suppressed, right? And hence the reason you see all these reds, right? I mean, our reproduction of heart disease mortality from publicly available data is always an underestimation, right? Because of suppression. We're losing data. So we would never overestimate, we would always underestimate, right? And hence you get this map that's all showing underestimation. But I think what's more interesting, of course, underestimation is a problem, but I think what's really interesting about this map is that it's not a random pattern. If it were, I would be okay with it, right? If we had some underestimation, some overestimation, and it was kind of scattered all over the map, I could still live with that. The problem with this is that, as you can see, that the underestimation tends to go sort of in the Great Plains area, which also tends to be more rural, right? So in fact, what's happening over here, using this publicly available data, I guess a sort of naive user, if you will, of the data, would be producing a map that basically biases against rural populations. So I guess to end, the key sort of theme, if you will, of this short presentation is that the spatial context that surrounds data is something that we often maybe even ignore a little bit, right? We don't necessarily think too much about it. The data is available to us through entities like the census and so on and so forth, right? There's obviously a lot of due diligence that's done on the data, but there are other processes at play. There are these sort of mechanisms at play that can lead to a lot of uncertainties in the data, and typically these uncertainties tend to be biased, right? And that can be a problem. So, sorry, I'll end there as a short, but I'll be happy to talk to you after this as well. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Daniella Ramirez. As he told you, I'm filling in for my boss, Ben McGill. I work with the Labor Market Intelligence Center at the Dallas Community College District's office. I'm fairly new and also fairly new to the world of education. I actually have a background in seismic mapping. Just tell you a little bit about what our center does. We are focusing and aligning academic programs to industry needs in our local economy. We're doing this by crosswalking the programs that we offer to occupations, and we're offering this information to the colleges so they can inform their students and so we can drive policy. We work very closely with our Department of Systemic Analysis and Reporting. Being a GIS technician, I actually map a lot of the demographic data of our students, and we are trying to see if our colleges are answering our student needs. Here's talked a little bit about this. Data is really important, and actually right now, a big missing part to our project is data granularity. That's a big missing part in labor market data, as usually wages and projections and even employment numbers are not available at a lower level than zip codes. We are focusing in, as I said before, driving policy by informing administrators about the best occupational opportunities in our economy. Let's see, and we are producing industry reports that we make available to our colleges, and we try to tell them what skills are being demanded. This we do through job posting analytics. One of the open sources that we use mostly include the BLS, the Texas Workforce Commission, and let's see, we work very closely with the COG. Like I said before, we are producing industry reports, and this has not been the easiest part, as there's a lot of ways to look at occupational data, especially when you're trying to crosswalk them to academic programs, because you can group these by occupational clusters or course clusters. The living wage site, this is a website that we helped create with our marketing team. We basically gathered the occupations that we train for, and we offer the wages, projection, growth information for students. And the website actually lets you calculate your living wage, what you should be earning to make a living wage depending on your household scenario. That is, if you're an adult working with a spouse that is not, or if you have kids, it includes all this and lets you know what you need to be earning. This is really important because the major goal of aligning these programs and taking on this project is to help with poverty problem in Dallas, which is huge, and as educators, that's the resources we have, training for middle skills, and this is the market that we attract, so this is a major problem that we have to tackle. Okay, like I said, we try to tie industry needs to what our students need. This is important because they don't have the resources sometimes, and we have to inform them of what, we have to guide them to pick a program that helps them get those skills they need to make a living wage. These are some of our the tools that we use. Some of them are proprietary sources. Not everything is open data. And these are some of our other partners. Most of these are open data, as you may see. Here's a map that we've been distributing through our colleges. It highlights the big income inequality that exists in our region. The South, as some of you may know, is not doing as well as the North, and this is what we're seeing when we map where industries are, where the occupations are. Most of them are in the North, and that's concerning to us because our students who live in the South are not faring as well, mostly because of the distance, and it's hard to move along through our region when you don't have the resources. Do any of you have any questions about what we do? I have a little bit extra time.
We'll just open it up to the floor.
Okay.
Do you guys, or any of you have any questions for any of our panelists? Yes, sir.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but when you were talking about the problems with the estimates once you get down to like disaggregate down to a very small area, can you talk a little bit about the balance between, because I know there's problems whenever you aggregate up to, and can you talk a little bit about finding a balance between the two decisions?
Thank you. Yes, I guess that's if anybody's taken a class in geography before, this is probably one of the first things you learn, and it's called the modifiable aerial unit problem, which I think is what you're referring to, and what it basically says is that as you change the scale, right, whether you aggregate up or aggregate down, is that the patterns that you observe on the map are likely to change, right? And I think what it fundamentally gets at is that a map that's produced is ultimately an abstraction of data, right? It's an abstraction at a geographic level that the map maker decides. Now, as you aggregate data up, right? So if I have fine scale data and I want to make it coarse, so let's say I have data at the block level, and I'd like to make maps at the county level. I don't necessarily violate the integrity of the data because as long as the units are contained, I'm not adding or removing extra information. However, what I am losing is the resolution on that data set, right? So I guess there are not data integrity issues as I'm going from fine scale to a coarser scale. However, there are issues in terms of loss of resolution. Going the other way around is much more problematic, right? Because you're then having to essentially make up data, right? You sort of, and there are certain sort of mechanisms you can use where you can say, well, this is the best guess that I would have at a finer geographic scale. So I think sort of downscaling of data, going from a coarse scale to a fine scale is much more problematic because there are data integrity issues then. But going from a fine scale up to a coarse scale, there may not necessarily be data integrity issues, but there's definitely loss of resolution. So I remember, at being at a geography conference a couple of years back, and there was a sort of panel of geographers, right, people who've been doing GIS for years, sort of the people who've written textbooks in geography, and somebody asked them, what should we do about the modifiable aerial unit problem? And I think the consensus of the panel is very interesting, and the panel comes back and says, choose the best possible unit, right? That was a response, which is really, not a good response, right? I mean, this person was looking for an answer, and they said, use a unit that's most appropriate. What does that mean? Well, that's for you as the user of the data, I suppose, to be able to justify and say, well, I'm using this data and for this purpose, right? So I think, unfortunately, there really isn't an answer as to what the appropriate unit is, but I think what would be interesting to look at is as you sort of change resolution of your data, how does that impact the reliability of your output, right? And reliability could mean two things. You could think of reliability in terms of the integrity of the data, and sort of reliability in terms of the resolution of the data. So I don't know if that quite answered your question. It was a roundabout answer to a question that doesn't have an answer, I suppose. But
in what ways might you possibly, in terms of getting authoritative data or reliable data from the public as a whole, maybe via their cell phones or whatnot, you may or may not want to rely upon that as reliable. Case in point, we've had situations with Ebola and where the outbreaks are occurring, or West Nile virus, and these kinds of things. Any suggestions or any progress in that area?
I think just somebody putting out a tweet, mining social media, and people are doing that. So you can put social media on a map. So as the activities in the Middle East were going on a couple of years, Arab Spring, folks were mapping that out to be able to see what was going on. But those are simply Facebook posts, little videos, etc. But for instance, at Clemson, somebody defined a form, created a form, and said, these are the questions. So I think it is very possible to get crowdsourced information by structuring what it is you're wanting to get. I mean, I've got a 311 app on my phone. There's a pothole out in our street. So, Dallas 311, take a photo, give me some comments. Oh, here's a pull down. And so more and more folks are doing those kinds of things. UMass Amherst, in their capital planning process a few years ago, took one of our templates and basically were crowdsourcing information from students, faculty, staff, people visiting to try and find out, we're going to maybe tear this power plant down. What do you think of that? And so it's, getting that kind of feedback and putting it into a planning process. The thing that I really found interesting with this Clemson thing was it actually turns into a focus, that map provides a clear picture of where people feel danger. And then to be able, that becomes actionable information. So same thing done, through Katrina, pick a disaster. People have been doing crowdsourcing, and so it's possible to get good stuff. If I could throw one more thing out, I don't know if it came across in Daniella's comments, but she was talking about lowering poverty and the implications of South Dallas County. We all know there's a big divide. The chancellor, this is the thing that just blew me away. The chancellor of the 7-college district picked that as this 50,000-foot mission to reduce poverty in Dallas County, and that becomes a mission for this this college district. And so this labor information system that they're putting together is really how to mine some of that data from BLS, et cetera, but then turn it into programs. If you don't have the welding program at Eastfield College that's going to be needed for the Toyota plant, what should we be doing? And so just being able to get that on a map, pretty powerful. Good job.
Well, I think we're out of time. Will you all take a moment and help me in thanking our panelists?